Who Cares About Watchmen? Episode 9, See How They Fly. Today we have the quartet of myself, Neo, and Tomtit from Australia, and Ingiga and Dilb from England, the four of us fans of the 1980s Watchmen comic that inspired the show, and mostly fans of the show and the recent work of its Commander-in-Chief, Damon Lindelof. Is this fair to say?
Yeah. Well, at least as far as the leftovers goes, I've not seen other Lindelof stuff personally.
Yeah, I'm starting to take into account the Peralta factor, like I think a lot of people are trying to cope.
I've seen like 2 episodes of Leftovers, and I liked him.
Yeah.
I mean to watch more.
On the topic of Watchmen, and this the finale, and this is spoiler talk now, of course, we saw how Lady True was a secret daughter of Ozymandias. We saw her spacecraft rescue Ozymandias from Europa. We saw her co-opt the 7th Cavalry's attempt to kill Dr. Manhattan and steal his powers. Then we saw her father, Ozymandias, thwart her attempt to gain Manhattan's powers by way of frozen squids raining from the sky. True killed Cyclops, True killed Manhattan, Squids killed True, Looking Glass killed Ozzy's pride by knocking him out with a wrench. Laurie and Looking Glass vowed to reveal Ozymandias' squidly hoaxes to the world. Angela's son, Topher, found out she was Sister Knight, a masked vigilante. Will Reeves moved in with the family, at least for a time. Angela swallowed an egg probably imbued with Manhattan's powers, presumably making her rather godly herself, and blue as well if the promotional photos that went with the show were anything to go by. And in Peteypedia, the extra textual in-universe documents accompanying the show, Dale Petey is heavily implied to be Lube Man, and he goes on the run himself with the FBI trying to catch him too. So I'm going to start everyone by asking things that we liked about the episode. Gig, what did you like about the finale?
Well, on the topic of the finale, on the whole, it was fun, and in particular, I loved all the Veidt stuff, like the opening 20-ish minutes with Adrian, the resolution of his whole storyline, the stuff with the Game Warden, the stuff with him sort of facing off with his daughter, and basically all of his self-aggrandizing antics in that stuff. I thought that was very fun. Basically, all of the stuff that that has very little to do with like Manhattan is mostly to do with Adrian. That stuff, that was very entertaining. I thought it was great.
Tomtit, what did you like about the finale?
Well, I cheered, I shouted, I fist pumped the air. But honestly, I probably liked the scene where the Game Warden asked if he was a good opponent and Veidt just says no. That made me laugh. The follow-up line when he's like, oh, but you put on a hell of a show, I was like, they could have just left it at a simple no, but yeah, that tickled me. And that's about it.
Dilb, what did you like about the finale?
I liked Looking Glass and Laurie. Their sort of little duo was quite fun. I wasn't expecting him to come back. I thought he'd just flown the coop, so I was quite pleased with his presence.
Yeah, I liked the how Ozymandias, who is of course a narcissist, was taken out by a Looking Glass in the end. That felt kind of in the spirit of Moore and the comic and that sort of thing. I thought that was quite good. In terms of what I liked, I loved Ozymandias being a Volcel. I've never given myself to a woman. Yeah. I thought that was great. I liked the mask stuff, like the point about why Veidt gave the Game Warden a mask and what Will Reeves says about masks, how wounds need air and masks make men cruel. I found all that interesting. I liked that. Adversaries keeping men sane as well. I felt like the Europa stuff connected to some of the themes of the Tulsa stuff quite well, like the adversaries keeping people sane ties into the 7th Cavalry controlled opposition with the cops and all that. Yeah. So what did we think about the finale in broader terms then?
I feel like there's going to be lots to say from everyone, so I'm just going to jump in there first. I think, on the whole, looking at it, it's basically... I don't want to make the obvious comparison, but we've already been talking about this. They pulled another Years and Years, basically. And what I mean by that is the opening episodes of the show, up to a certain point, are suggesting all sorts of brilliant, daring, radical, exciting, dramatic possibilities, which the series doesn't actually have any intention of delivering upon.
For clarity, Years and Years was a 2019 sci-fi-ish family saga mini-series that we also covered with podcasts and videos on this channel.
And the finale, in that sense, is pockmarked with numerous little disappointments, kind of, where things are much less interesting than you maybe expect they were going to be. And on the whole, what seems to become clear about the finale in relation to the series overall is that probably Manhattan shouldn't have been in the show. Because, yeah, like, almost looking at it, it becomes clear that actually more taking Manhattan off the board at the end of the book was almost trying to spare us this, because it's, it becomes apparent that if John is in the story at all, the world just revolves around him, which is why Moore, gets rid of him at the end. Like, that was part of his point. Like, you can't just have this superhero figure in the realistic world, because it just goes to hell in a handbasket. And taking Manhattan out would force any follow-up to be about much more immediately interesting and relevant things, which the show was up until about episode 6. So, there you go.
The finale has sullied the rest of the show probably to a greater extent than Years and Years did, but I still generally would recommend, like, the beginning of the season to people. Yeah.
I think actually seeing it, I agree with the sentiment that it kind of sort of just takes away from all the big mystery and stuff of it. But I guess it was cohesive and, like, really just tied everything together to a point where maybe it didn't really surprise. Like, I was kind of just expecting it to go how it did.
The first 6 episodes I hold a lot of praise for. I think they're really good television, and I think there's interesting stuff in the 7th, and there's things I like about the 8th and 9th. But in terms of the overall experiment, I think it was a good try, this show, and I'll recommend it to people that I think will like it. Like, it's a good television show, but I do think the finale, it reframed things, as Veit would say, problematically. Like, here's one thing from a Lindelof interview that he did yesterday. He said, in original incarnations of the series, the 7th Cavalry had a plan that was involving mind control and masks. There was a mind control device woven into the fabric of the yellow masks and the 7th Cavalry Rorschach masks, so an entire army of cops and cavalry members alike could be controlled by whoever was in charge of that, and Will Reeves was going to hijack that remote from Keene's hands. It was finally the revelation of, can the cavalry also be making a play for Dr. Manhattan, and Lady True is piggybacking on their plan? When we abandoned this ridiculous idea of mind control, that's when everything slipped into place. End quote. And that's like, they had the mesmerism stuff in episode 6, and then it was just dropped, and that feels really odd with the finale and then the whole series in mind then, as does the stuff like how True gave everyone in Tulsa free HD TVs, and there feels like a lot of dropped threads, which I don't feel in the comic, and I didn't feel in The Leftovers, Lindelof's last show, or that was constructed to kind of be resistant to this whole kind of looking for threads in the first place. But it felt oddly sloppy to me, that kind of thing.
That quote you just read out, I think there's an irony there which Lindelof does not seem to catch, which is that he's like, oh, well, we dropped the ridiculous idea of mind control fabric masks to go with the eminently not silly at all idea of turning yourself into a blue willy god thing. It's like, in terms of actually telling an interesting story, like, I'm not sure Manhattan being a MacGuffin to turn you into God is actually that much less silly of an idea than, mass mind control. Like, in terms of political and thematic ramifications, it's kind of on the same ballpark in my idea. It reminds me of something that I think it might have been Tip, but someone said it around episode 6, which is that, using, for example, mind control to talk about racism, it's, you're taking something that's real and gritty and harsh and difficult and doing it in a silly way, in kind of a sci-fi sort of fantasy way, and it's, to some extent, it's a bit of a cop-out, and I think all the God stuff is slightly like that for this.
Yeah, my issue with the whole becoming Manhattan thing isn't that it's not built in the comic at all. I don't care about that. The show's the show. It can make up its own ideas. I thought it was inelegant how they suddenly just said, oh, you can eat a thing and become like Manhattan, but whatever, the show's doing its own thing. It can make that up. My issue was it never happened. like the whole thing of the comic is that the big world-changing thing does happen in the end. Veidt's plan happens, and we assume it's probably going to work, or maybe it won't. That's the interesting thing about the ambiguity of the ending. But the ending is something happening, whereas this ending is like so superhero show or cop show in that everyone maintains the status quo. The big change doesn't happen. A new person doesn't become a god and change things. They prevent that from happening. Things stay mostly the same. The heroes save the day by preserving the status quo. And that feels so like Lindelof said he wanted to disrupt the comic Watchmen. He wanted to be brave. And I don't feel like this is in the spirit of the bravery of the comic. And I certainly don't feel this is like being even braver by disrupting the comic. I feel like this is much more like a very traditional superhero thing, because a big thing didn't change. They stopped a big thing changing. What would the ramifications been of Lady True becoming a god? What would she have done to, racism in the country or people's trauma? Remember how she had all those philosophical ideas about trauma and memory? What would she have done? We'll never know, because things stayed the same in the end. That was the story of the show. And I just find that so dissatisfying, because the show had really developed its themes interestingly, and it had thrown up a lot of interesting ways for things to go. So for the heroes to stop things happening, I didn't like that.
Yeah, there was sort of almost nothing in this episode to really challenge or unsettle the general viewer, or like no memorable images either for me. It's sort of a lot of soundstage work, and which is odd because I read an interview where he said that he didn't want the finale to reflect the last issue of the book where people stand around and talk because it's a visual medium. But and like I get that, but the one we ended up with was still sort of a lot of people standing around sound stages and, talking. It's just done in a very fast, urgent way. And it didn't really grab me. And I feel like this is probably a finale that I'll forget about in like a month's time, which maybe it's saving grace.
I think it really suffers from the problem of just being it's so normal. Like, it's the kind of finale you would see on like season 1 of some, decent show, perhaps an unamazing show.
There was a blue skybeam. There was literally blue light pointing upward, like in any like superhero movie.
Yeah, there's so much like blue beams of energy and shit, and you got 30 seconds till the countdown, and Manhattan runs out and disappears, and all that stuff. It's so weird and almost absurd to end the show in this way if you're trying to have the name of Watchmen and bear the name of Watchmen, because, part of what makes Watchmen so memorable is that it's kind of haunting. Like, you read it and it's like, oh, fuck, Like, I'm not saying, I don't think necessarily the show needed to end with the entire world being changed or whatever. I think the stakes could easily be much lower and much smaller than in the book, but like, as long as there was something to actually, like Tit says, like, challenge the viewer. And it's cutesy. I think basically the final 3 episodes of the show basically amount to a cutesy fanfic rather than a true successor, that something's actually trying to push the envelope and actually leave people's jaws on the floor. Like, I find it funny and amusing that Veidt basically, shoots down a bunch of little squids to, stop his kind of narcissistic daughter from changing the status quo, but that's amusing, and that's not something that's going to stick with me for like 20 years or whatever.
The most unsettling thing is like the idea that one of your maids steals one of your bottles of vile sperm. It's bizarre. Like, Lady True to me feels like a ancestor of like the disgruntled Stark employee from a Marvel movie, It's that level of villain.
Yeah.
Right? Like, I couldn't believe what I was seeing.
There's a note about Lady True that I think is interesting, and it's about the actress Hong Chow, who Lindelof said she was treated basically as a producer or like a creative consultant, because she was the only really prominent person of Vietnamese descent in the show. So he would like send her the audition reels for the Vietnamese actors, the characters, because he wanted to know, are they actually speaking Vietnamese? And he would like run through the Vietnamese elements of the script with this actress because he was unsure if they were, problematic or they had issues or whatnot. So she wasn't just an actress. She was like a kind of a creative deal for the show. And I feel like that's an issue to me, because for there to be so little like representation of that in the writer's room, it kind of speaks to why the Vietnam stuff felt undercooked in the end. And I think you can apply that more broadly to the show with like, in the finale, the elements we're saying undercooked. Like, what exactly went wrong there? Why didn't they go bigger or go bolder or make things change more? Because like half the writers' room were pretty big fans of the comic, Lindelof says, and the other half were more new to it. So I don't know what happened for them to not want to push things so much. Why do you think they went this way in the end?
I think it could be because Lindelof maybe just sees a certain like pulpiness in the novel that like I personally don't. I mean, it's obviously like the squid is a pulpy trope, but the actual shape of the story is more of like I mean, parts of it are noir, parts of it are sort of conspiracy, but like it's not using the shape of a superhero story is what I mean. It's just using the characters. And I think Lindelof, because like most of his experience is in genre work, you know, like Prometheus and shit like that, Star Trek, which doesn't necessarily like transcend the boundaries of the genre's shape. So I think he's kind of just writing what he knows. I don't know. I don't have an answer, basically.
I think that interview quote where he says, that you mentioned earlier, where he says originally they wanted it to be like the last issue of the comic where everyone was in monologuing, but then they said, actually, no, we shouldn't do that. It needs to be exciting because it's a visual medium and so on and so forth. And for the record, I don't necessarily agree with that conclusion there, but I think that's revealing because I think in their heads they were like, well, it needs to be a proper TV finale. It needs to be exciting. It needs to wrap everything up and this and that. And I think they'd set themselves such a huge challenge and a puzzle in terms of getting all of these elements in and getting them to work together that I think what we have in this finale is just like the best they could do in terms of getting an episode of television together rather than them actually. I think they probably might have liked to do something crazier and wilder, but maybe they just literally just couldn't work out how to do anything, so they just lowered their ambition slightly.
Speaking of not working out what to do, Dilb, since you're the big Looking Glass fan, can I ask what you thought of how he treated Veidt and like how he knocked him out in the end and his general kind of just reaction to Veidt in general?
Yeah, I was expecting like some kind of big confrontation. I actually kind of liked his sort of sad, like resigned curiosity when he asks him about the squid and stuff. But yeah, it felt like Looking Glass was kind of a spare part for a lot of it, just sort of tagging along. He's never seen like Dr. Manhattan before, and he's just sort of there, you know?
Yeah, there was kind of a real comic reunion aspect with like Laurie seeing Manhattan, although they don't really have much of an exchange, but then Veidt and Laurie meeting up again definitely has this, you know, comic aspect. And then when they see Archie, the owlship of Dan Dryberg, who is the big major, one of the main characters from the comic, he's the sole one that was alive in the timeline of the show but never appeared. And he finally got name checked, and like there's all these things kind of connecting to the comic, and I agree with Gig that it all kind of feels like they couldn't really manage something ambitious, and so they kind of fell back on a more regular TV finale and also the kind of fan servicey stuff that they sometimes did in the show. And that it's like I wasn't not enjoying it a lot of the time, but I wasn't, like Tit said, I wasn't being challenged by it, and that's a damn shame.
Yeah, regarding the comic reunion aspect, it's like particularly the Veidt and Laurie stuff, it strikes me that to a certain extent is leaning into this whole sort of, nostalgia, the gang's back together, God, what if they quip to each other about the stuff that happened in the comic, guys? And that's the sort of stuff obviously that we see all over, you know, pop culture now, you know, because every franchise is now doing this, you know, old characters come back. And what struck me is that something we saw recently which skewered that thing so nicely, in my opinion, was, you know, the return of Twin Peaks, which kind of had this thing of old characters coming back, but sort of unsettled that in a way that was actually provocative and sort of undermined it in various ways and sort of kind of set you up to expect some kind of wholesome reunion, but then sort of delayed gratification on that and undermined it and stuff. And so like it seems like it's annoying that 2 years ago we've had, you know, a major television series completely kind of puncturing that whole style.
A major what?
A major television series. Oh God, fucking hell. Literally, I thought my connection got out. You hadn't heard me, but you were just taking the piss. Very funny. Anyway, it's annoying to have had like a major work skewer that so well, but for a follow-up to Watchmen that is kind of doing a similar thing with a 30-year time skip, to not really lean into that nearly as much.
Yeah, the interesting thing there is Twin Peaks: The Return was such a success that many prestigious film associations are calling it like the best film of the 2010s and such. And whatever you can think of their classification reasonings, like clearly this resounded with a lot of people in a huge way, and it had a huge merit and worth and prestige to it that it really earned. And this was it wasn't just by being resistant to its past. Like, the return did a whole bunch of new things to itself that weren't just about its relationship to the 90s seasons of Twin Peaks, but it really indicated that there's a lot of storytelling worth and things you can do if you have zero interest in pandering to like nostalgia. And it's odd because I know Lindelof loved The Return, as did, most showrunners like Lindelof, Noah Hawley, all these people, they loved The Return. We loved The Return. It was very popular amongst, TV geek people. So it confuses me that not many shows are seeming to pick up its lessons, in terms of really interacting with resisting nostalgia in that way. Like, this show talked a lot about nostalgia, but it went pretty hard for the nostalgia in the end in a lot of ways. Like, the thing with Laurie saying, oh, we're finally going to prosecute Ozzy and stuff, it's like, this is just like limply extending the comics ending and changing Laurie's mind. Like, that isn't a new direction or anything. So it confuses me why Lindelof and other people aren't taking lessons from that work called Twin Peaks: The Return. Yeah.
It's ironic you mentioned nostalgia, but nostalgia, the drug, was not mentioned in this episode at all, despite being by far one of the show's best new ideas, most interesting new ideas.
Was it this podcast that had the idea that True would be sort of transmitting... So, because there's something about how the True company has the rights to American Hero Story.
Will Reeves inherited the rights from Captain Metropolis, who left them to him in his will. So he has the rights to the Minutemen and everything, and he's in cahoots with True, and True's installed free HD TVs all over Tulsa. We weren't the only ones. Like, a lot of people independently came up with these ideas of, is True going to, transmit some kind of hypnosis or mesmerism or, an empathy bomb with the Millennium Clock? I assume that's what you're talking about, one of those ideas.
I think an empathy bomb would have been a lot more interesting, and it would have been something happening.
And the fact that we were far from the only people, loads of people came up with those ideas, confuses me, because I assume they came up in the writer's room as well, and I'm interested why they didn't go with them. Like, these aren't big budget ideas. An empathy bomb isn't a hard idea to do. Just film a lot of people reacting to a TV and then, acting different and having different dialogue about how they feel now. So
you cut in some flashbacks too, since the shows are good at that. It strikes me that on the True front, specifically the Millennium Clock, that was another thing that people had so many kind of imaginative, crazy, exciting ideas about. Like, what does it mean to say it tells time? What's that code for? Could it be to do with time travel? To do with memories? Is it going to warp some shit? Like, what's the significance of it being positioned in like the center of America geographically? What's it going to do? And it just turns out to be a gimmick that turns you into Dr. Manhattan. How disappointing. Could they have picked anything more disappointing for the clock to be outside of just being an actual clock that has no other purpose?
I mean, I'm on record as like not being entirely crazy about the mind control idea, but to me, compared to this, it's like, at least it's indelibly linked to like the world of Oklahoma that they were creating in the early episodes, whereas bringing in Dr. Manhattan just feels like an afterthought,
Speaking of Oklahoma, I have to say I loved when they used the opening song from Oklahoma for the after effects of the Frozen Squidfall. I didn't love how the Frozen Squidfall was really realised. I felt like that was oversold, probably in the script and in Ozzy's dialogue, talking about it's going to be so destructive. And we only saw True die, and the city didn't look that trashed in the end. But I loved circling back to the premiere and using another song from Oklahoma, the musical there, for no real reasons beyond, like, fan service. And I knew that thing.
Speaking of that sequence, when that song's playing, that's the bit where Topher sees Angela's costume in kind of hung up, and they have that sort of wordless bit where they look at each other, and it's like, oh my god, he's realizing that his Angela is a vigilante and stuff. That was another thing that reminded me of Years and Years, because that finale also had a sequence where like something was kind of given fake payoff and kind of to suggest to you that something cool ought to have happened, but they didn't actually follow through on it. I'm specifically thinking of the bit where the sort of the fantasy sequence about what might the fate of be, which kind of teases you with the idea of something cool happening there, but they didn't actually pay it off. And here, like, Topher was so signified and so interesting and so set up up for stuff earlier on in the series, and he gets no lines in this episode.
Yeah.
Nothing at all. He just looks at Angela. Angela pulls a face for a bit, and it's like, oh, great.
Yeah, I think on that note of him looking meaningfully and shocked at the Sister Knight costume and then to his mum, my issue with that, I like the moment for what it's worth, but my issue is we never got, or at least I never got clarity for the actual public knowledge of the cop superheroes, Sister Knight, Looking Glass, Red Scare, Pirate Jenny, everyone. Like, do people know about these? Are there like drawings of them? Are they talked about in the newspapers, or is it real locked down and they just wear it so the 7th Cavalry can't see them? Like, has anyone seen Sister Knight in public and like posted on the internet, oh, look at this vigilante in Tulsa, cool costume and stuff? Like,
There's no internet in this timeline, remember?
oh, true, but do you know what I'm saying? Like, does anyone know about these people beyond people who would be at like crime scenes? Like, is it? I know that it's only there to like supposedly combat the 7th Cavalry and their doxing of the cops and that. But is there any public knowledge of them? Is my question.
Well, we saw the paparazzi photographing them in episode 2, I think.
Yeah,
so I think they're out in public enough that they've probably been seen. Like, I doubt their existence is the secret so much as, you know, their actual true identities are the secret.
So do you assume Topher like knows of Sister Knight? Like, he's seen that before and he like knows, oh, that's a superhero cop in Tulsa. Do you think he...
I mean, even if he doesn't know who Sister Knight specifically is, like, if he sees that costume, he can assume that it's a vigilante costume. Like, what else is it going to be, really?
I mean, we, the viewer, haven't seen Sister Knight since episode 4. And I would argue this hasn't really been a show about cops since, like, episode 6. I think they would they thought we wouldn't notice that they just sort of brushed off the whole talking about cops element.
You know what really hurts there is this was a really good, interesting cop show. The show was doing really well with its themes, in my opinion. The stuff it was doing with Tulsa and cops and generational trauma and racial legacy and all that, that was really working for me, and I thought it was going super well. And so it's just so annoying that Lindelof says, well, you can't have Watchmen without Dr. Manhattan, and proceeds in the last 3 episodes to give us this, I'm sorry, this hideous take. I like the actor, and I like his acting for what it's worth, but his Manhattan did not look good with the... I'm not going to harp on this point. We talked a lot last podcast about that, but you know what I'm saying? That it abandoned a lot of what was not just working well, but was working really well. What was really going well as a show, and I really loved to do this stuff instead.
It's very glib what we get of the 7th Cavalry in this episode, considering I know Lindelof had a whole thing about how, well, you know, the cavalry are inept, really. Like, they couldn't be like a real major threat or whatever. But yeah, I think you can have the cavalry be incompetent and stuff, and obviously Keen's death is very funny in this episode, but you can have that and still at least have the themes be in play still. I think there's some problems there. Like, they have this whole thing about how all the leaders of Cyclops have assembled here, and Lady True kills them all, great, but apparently it seems like that's Will's endgame, just like killing a bunch of people in this room, and it's like, well, okay, I can see how that's something he might want, but given what Will has seen and everything Will has gone through, the thought that he'd be satisfied with just taking out like a few, figureheads, basically, rather than seeing through to the deeper underlying problems of, society, that's really annoying. It's one of those liberal things, not to harp on this, but like, it's one of the things where, oh, well, the system isn't the problem, it's just this evil racist cult inside the system, that's the problem. Yeah, and it's almost annoying, actually, in that little speech that True starts to read out, where she's like, ooh, Cyclops, you have terrorized people all the way back to the Greenwood Massacre. And it's like, the Greenwood Massacre, that actually happened. That wasn't just like a little, like, cult thing doing that. That was American society itself doing that. You can't just put it in a box and then say, oh, okay, we're killing the box. Bravo, problem solved. It's refusing to look deeper down into the underlying problems, which it's annoying, and I think it sells out some of the good stuff in the earlier episodes.
Yeah, I agree so hard, and I'm going to get on the soapbox a bit here. First minor point is, like, in the first episode, how the humorously modified Rorschach speech had that line about liberal tears, and that's not a thing like white supremacists or the alt-right say. No, people don't say liberal tears. It's not an actual thing. You can tell this is a bunch of
liberals?
Yeah, you can tell this is a bunch of liberals trying to write these type of people, I would say without really getting inside their heads at all, which, you know, you can argue is good ethically, that's fine, but I don't think it's good writing. And then in this episode, we had another line about, you know, we were going to have ourselves a little culture war. Kane says, no one would say that. That's not what these people say. And this flippancy with the cavalry, I don't think it's cute, and I don't think it's, like, morally justifiable the way the show wants to do. Like, there's another Lindelof quote where he says what made the comic appealing to him is that Veidt stops a nuclear war from happening temporarily, but you don't come away from the comic thinking peace is going to hold forever because it's our nature to point weapons at another. So there was never going to be a version of this show where white supremacy was going to be defeated. Therefore, you couldn't take that on in the finale. You had to sideline the 7th Cavalry. And no, no, you didn't. Like, the show consistently treated them flippantly and wasn't interested in really exploring them. And I don't find that, like, justified in that liberal way of, well, obviously they're wrong, so we don't need to consider them at all. I'm not saying you need to humanize them or justify them, but it's just bad writing to have your villain be these completely evil, you know, group that you never explore at all, and then you get less interested in, because these are like these are actual, this resonates with people because there are actual groups like this. You know, there's, you know, an actual alt-right movement, there's actual white supremacists, there's actual cults like that. And to just be so flippant about it and never explore them and just toast them away in the end like that, it annoyed me a lot, and it disappointed me big time. You know, the show abandoned the cop and Tulsa stuff a lot, but even when it wasn't, it was treating them in a very flippant way.
On the plus side, Senator Keene wearing the Manhattan panties was very funny, and some of his dialogue was so, like, cheesy to the point where it just wrapped around and became quite funny. Like, I'm gonna squeeze your man like a grape, yeehaw! Like, all of that shit.
I really loved how the order of, like, the injustices, he said, was first they took our guns, and then they made us say sorry. It's like that they're saying sorry is like the truly catastrophic thing that he's really wounded about. I thought that was funny. And it's like it's really hard to be a white man in America right now. Like, these are funny lines, but the show never engaged with white supremacy in a meaningful or interesting way at all. And I think that's a mark against the writing of it to me.
One more line that I thought was funny in that Keene bit was, he says, Adrian Veidt unleashed his monster on the world. Not the giant one-eyed octopus, but his puppet president! I found that funny. That crystallized the whole Robert Redford thing for me a bit. The idea that a liberal president would be as much of a sort of a spectre to these people as the squid itself, that sort of made a bit more sense of that whole thing, but it still didn't really, like, pay off in any really, like, cool way.
Can I ask a Tomtit as an Australian, and so naturally more, well, anyway, what do you think of this whole point about the cavalry and Keene and how that was all written?
Well, okay, first of all, I don't know what you were going to say. If you don't want to elab, then that's fine. But yeah, it felt like this episode was really written in just like a sheltered point of view where, like, you don't need to take the white supremacist threat seriously. I'm sure that's not what they intended, but that's how it came across to me. And then that just coupled with the decision to make the real villain like a anti-imperialist radical, it just all felt very I don't know, just like a spit in the face to good television. I don't know.
It's like you say, it's not that we're like saying you needed to make them more good and like say, oh, it's not that bad, or no, it's like it's not black and white morality. It's not that, but it's like, I don't want to say offensive, but to like treat it so like minimalized and like flippant, it feels weird because, like Gig said, the Greenwood massacre was a real thing that happened, and these white supremacist groups are a real thing that happened. So to write them like this, it feels skeevy to me.
Although I think everything in this episode was a bit like flippant. Like, before Lady True gets wiped out by the squid, you have that little like, oh, motherfucker beat, which is supposed to be funny, but it's not, you know. And,
also, you have the religious symbolism, there's kind of the Snyder crucifix on the wall that falls down as soon as she's about to get smashed. Like, that was...
And the stigmata in her hand.
Yeah.
I'm just thinking about how the last image of Ozymandias that we're left with chronologically in the show's events is him getting, like, handcuffed and taken away to jail like this is an episode of Scooby-Doo or some fucking shit.
You know what's messed up about that is, like, this show about like the ethics of policing and cops and, you know, culture wars and that, it has Laurie getting Veidt arrested is treated as like the moral victory. Like, that is really weird for this show of all shows, don't you think? like this uncritical faith in like the legal system and just to treat the cops as like the default resolution. And do you know where I'm going with this? You can probably express it better than me.
To hand wave, well, I think you expressed it fairly well, but to hand wave Laurie's role in keeping the squid conspiracy like hush hush felt lazy to me. Like, I feel like Lindelof, he kind of just had those characters in that spot, and rather than, writing something which felt relevant to the themes, he just kind of pulled this scene out of a hat, where he gets arrested and it's, a big cheer moment. Or I think that's how it's supposed to be played. I'm not entirely sure.
Also, there was a line, Vite is like, oh, are you going to arrest the president? And she's like, maybe. Which was like, well, okay, hang on a minute. Because obviously that question throws up so many other questions, in terms about institutional power. Because obviously the expected answer to, is the FBI just going to arrest the president, is, fuck no, of course it isn't. Because, as history has so often shown, that sort of thing simply does not happen. But it feels like the fact that they have Laurie give her sort of sassy answer to that, like, maybe we'll arrest the president, the world's not going to end. It seems like, this is going to sound so stupid, but it seems weirdly like it seems like a Trump thing, like they made it a Trump thing at the last minute, and that concerns me. Do you know what I'm saying? Like, I don't know. That was
absolutely the vibe I got. Yeah.
Yeah. It came to it occurred.
Basically, like it's glib rather than politically, insightful or incisive in any way, and that's irritating because the book is a great political satire.
Speaking of racial violence, I was really dissatisfied with how Hooded Justice's ending is like him just saying, well, the god could have done a bit more, and just like kind of, do you know what, Hooded Justice ended his whole saga of American history and racial violence, and he just kind of waves it off, like just saying, oh, we could have done a bit more, and like there's the symmetry of him being back at the theatre at the end, but I feel like the laziest way to do a finale is just to connect it to the premiere and rift off a premiere, because it's just very basic, like you recall the beginning of something and it feels satisfying because it's like a loop. It's a very easy way to do finales, and it just felt like Hooded Justice didn't really go anywhere after his amazing 6th episode. I didn't like I agree Dr. Manhattan could have done a bit more, obviously, but the show could have done a bit more about the point that he could have done a bit more. You know what I'm saying?
I think the show was way too neutral on Dr. Manhattan in general. I mean, all the stuff about his role in Vietnam is hand waved away, especially by the simple act of putting him with Angela, in a romantic relationship. And, she was literally raised as a child, idolizing him as a god. And that's all never addressed. It's just a sweet love story, la la la. And, you have all this stuff about Dr. Manhattan as a symbol of white power, which, they went in a different direction by putting him in the body of Cal. But they never do anything with that either. And, I don't know. It's just the Dr. Manhattan strand is just a void of substance, basically.
Yeah, the Dr. Manhattan stuff. It strikes me that as much as I don't really rate it that much as a direction for the story in general to go, there is clearly something that could be done there, because you have the white supremacists viewing Manhattan as this ubermensch who they can become, and obviously that makes a certain sense. And then you have, with the ending, you have what seems to be a little bit of a conspiracy going on between Hooded Justice and Manhattan himself prior to his death to get Angela to maybe eat that egg and possibly inherit Manhattan's powers and become whatever on earth she would then become with the experiences she has had and those abilities. I mean, Lindelof has been in interviews suggesting that white supremacy is going to be in for a bad time if Angela gets those powers and stuff. And they're okay, fair enough. There is a certain, revolutionary impulse in the idea of creating a sort of omnipotent, black Avenger who wants to, take sort of revenge out on white supremacy and all that stuff. But the thing is, that's an actual story, and if that's a story, that is the story. That's not just a glib thing to maybe gesture at the end of the story. That's the only thread of actual story anywhere in this Manhattan shit in the show. And they have just a weird scene of her eating a raw egg, and then she is about to step into a pool, and that's all we get. That's so fucking bizarre. The egg shit is so weird in general, because they thread the egg stuff throughout the entire show. They've got everyone thinking there's going to be some crazy cosmic egg kind of theory stuff where the universe is an egg or whatever, and it's just her eating a raw egg so she can become Manhattan, but we don't see it. It just doesn't make any sense. I don't understand why they did any of the stuff. It's just so fucking strange.
I feel like the eggs are much more of a motif than a symbol, and that they're frequently just used to be in the show without really mapping onto specific ideas. Like, I think there's always, the new life, because eggs represent new life, can tie into the generational and legacy themes of the show. And more so, maybe eggs kind of can work as a representation of paradoxes, because chicken and the egg, and so eggs kind of represent Manhattan in that way. The comic is overflowing with amazingly deployed literary motifs and symbols and allegories and all these kinds of techniques that all feed into each other and all very focused. Like, you can read them in a lot of ways, but their connections are very, they really work and they've really been considered, and the comic really crackles with intelligence. You can tell that the two very, intelligent men created this with so much thought. Even as they were improvising, parts of it, there was so much intelligence going into it. And then the show was written by a lot of people who are very creative, and I'm sure they're very smart and everything, but stuff like the egg motif just makes me kind of go, like, I'm not really feeling the smarts here. Do you
they just put it in for that image at the end of her drinking the egg, like...
Yeah.
And sort of, because it felt so clunky the way it was addressed before, like, we can put his powers in an egg. And it's like, okay, that's where they're going. Great.
Look,
What
Ma, I
then?
did a symbolism.
Yeah.
I think it's very appropriate to the themes and motifs of the show that it's written by the son of the creator of Lost, I mean, am I wrong in that? Like, I haven't done the research, but Nick Cuse is the son of Carlton Cuse, right?
Yeah.
I mean, Nick Cuse wrote some of the really cool Leftovers episodes, didn't he, with Lindelof? So
yeah, he
it's
was
like,
on International Assassin.
Yeah, so, and also, the pilot of Watchmen was great as well, which he was on too. So I was expecting something really kind of crazy and trippy for this, and it was just so normal. Like, I think the least exciting episodes of the show generally have been the ones that felt the most like normal television, and the least like experimental kind of fun boundary pushing television. And this was one of those, And that point about Moore and Gibbon, the creative team behind the book just being so overflowingly like creative and everything just so considered, and the show in comparison, it really is a Chad and the Virgin scenario. Like, it's so despairingly mundane. Like, this is like, yep, okay, this sure is the work of a bunch of TV writers somewhere trying to do an imitation of Watchmen, and that's what it ends up being. And it's just frustrating, because you got some genuine nuggets of brilliance in the first half of the series.
I want to stress, I think everyone involved here is really good at their jobs. Like, I think they're all making television at a high level, and it's HBO, and the people here, the writers, they are skilled and they're talented and they're doing good work, but a lot of the people here have done better is the issue, and they're trying to live up to a comic that is incredible. It's a masterpiece of the form, and that's the issue. I'm not saying anyone here is like untalented, but I'm saying they set themselves a really high goal, and you didn't meet it, so it is what it is. No one was forced to make a Watchmen show. Lindelof chose to do this after being offered 3 times, and you can read the biblical allegory into that, for sure. But like, they didn't have to do this, and they did do this, so I'm going to judge them for how good a job they did or did not do.
Should have watched more Outer Limits episodes.
Moore and Gibbons, they described the original Watchmen book as being like a jewel, like with all the symbols and motifs, like it reflects from any angle and any side, and it's just all these patterns and stuff. And in that sense, this show is very much like an egg. It doesn't reflect anything.
You crack it open, it spills everywhere.
I really agree. I think the mark of a great story, or at least what I take as great stories, what really appeals to me is, like I love that jewel idea. I haven't used that before. That's really good. But the refracting idea that all the component parts of a story reflect on each other, like the micro represents the macro represents the micro. I think this is what you find in like masterpieces, where like every storyline reflects each other, and they interact with each other, and they feed into each other. And the comic absolutely does this in spades, and not just in the really, it's funny to say literal, but stuff like the Black Friday sub-story reflecting on multiple characters' journeys. Not just that, but down to like the symbols used and how the use of the symbols involves. It's all done such an interconnected, fantastic level. And I don't blame the show for not living up to that, but it's Watchmen, so this is how you're going to get judged. But I will say, I felt like the show's Dave Gibbons, the illustrator. I say illustrator of the comic, and I feel like I'm doing him a disservice because he was the creative team, with Moore. They mapped out this story together. They did the world building together. It wasn't like Moore just sent him the scripts and Gibbons just dumbly drew them, albeit really well. He was the other half of this. But for the show, I felt like that was Nicole Castle, who directed episodes 1, 2, and 8. And she always said she was trying to imbue her episodes with loads of symbols, and not just to reflect the comic, but just visual storytelling in general. And she had her own little ticks, all the split diopter shots she was using. I was quite happy with some of the not the writing side of the show and stuff like that, but yeah, the show's more equivalents, which I guess were the 6 or 7 or so writers. I know there were 2 stages of writers' rooms, but yeah, it's very hard to live up to Alan Moore. The guy's amazing.
I guess I want to talk a little bit about Hooded Justice's speech at the end, because I feel like it was kind of meant to be the centerpiece of the episode, but it fell short for me. But I don't know, I may be in the minority, but it kind of felt to me and I'm interested. Right, yeah.
Well, I think in today's world, you feel like you're in the minority, as people would say.
Oh god. Yeah, moving on. It kind of felt like to me he was saying you shouldn't be angry about all the injustices, and because I couldn't stop thinking about Hooded Justice. He wore his mask, and in wearing that mask, he actually got a lot of material shit done against Cyclops, and he's here saying no, masks are bad, when it was the Minutemen who were after the fucking publicity the whole time, who were actively impeding that progress, and they were all out in the open. But this Hooded Justice anonymous guy, he was actually out there you've seen episode 6, did it feel a little out of step to you?
Yeah, you heard me in the 6th podcast. I was harping on about how I was in love with Hooded Justice and what he was doing, because I was so supporting these material goods, and he'd won me back over to superhero fiction because I was so in joint with this power fantasy. Now I saw a superhero that was actually absolutely doing such material good, and then at the end he's well, masks, not a good idea. Those wounds need air. And I think that works with the mask theme the show is doing. I don't agree, personally, exactly with what it's saying, but at least it was connecting to a theme of the show. And at that stage in the episode, that was enough to satisfy me, I guess.
I think with the mask thing, I think it's maybe a bit uncharitable to take the line as him saying that, you fighting crime is bad, or fighting Nazi cops and Nazis and KKK and stuff is bad or whatever. Rather, the nuance that speech tries to put on it is that what he specifically says is that you can't heal behind a mask in terms of yourself. You can't, in terms of whatever kind of fundamental trauma pushed you to adopt that mask, you can't actually move on from that trauma until you let that mask drop, which I think there's substance to that, but I question how relevant it really is to, Hooded Justice's story, or the kind of the themes of him and Angela and just stuff in general. It's a bit of a weird thing for him to sort of drop in right at that point, and for that to be the closing statement of that whole storyline. It's a bit weird.
That's where I come back to my point that, yeah, it's probably bad for you personally and your relationships. You're also doing a shitload of material good, and you're fashioning yourself as a hero. So there's a bit of sacrifice involved. So I'm not struck by, oh my God, this hero who was doing so much good, he wasn't healing quite right. He wasn't mentally healthy. His relationships were bad. That's all really sad, and I feel bad for him, but I wouldn't really make the trade-off that this guy had better relationships and didn't get a bunch of racists destroyed and didn't materially improve so many people's lives. I'll take the superhero, please. You know what I mean?
Sorry. I just meant, considering drama wasn't really played upon, I didn't really get the sense that he was really remorseful for wearing a mask until his speech at the end.
Yeah.
So yeah, do we know who Lindelof was taking inspiration from in his depiction of Will Reeves in this episode?
No, go on.
Okay, well, you'll love this. Apparently that whole strand of this episode was inspired by Dumbledore in Harry Potter.
Yeah, I remember that interview quote. Yeah. Oh, gosh.
How Dumbledore... This is Lindelof's favourite book. How Dumbledore wants to teach Harry a lesson, and he lets Harry learn the lesson himself, and then he explains what the lesson was. And that's why the episode is the way it is. And that wasn't the only time this episode reminded me of J.K. Rowling.
Are you having a joke, or are you being serious right now? Did Lindelof actually cite Harry Potter and J.K. Rowling?
Yeah, that's... Yeah, on the I think it was the official podcast. He talks about how much he loves Harry Potter and how it's his favorite book.
Yeah, I can verify this. That is in there. I read that as well.
Definitely queuing up that pasta image of the politics of Harry Potter right now. I tell you, oh man.
And I was like flabbergasted to see that after I watched the episode, because while I was actually watching the episode, the whole ending with the idea of who deserves Dr. Manhattan's power, and it's Angela, and she deserves it because she didn't seek it out. It was just offered to her. And that's just the fucking philosopher's stone.
You see this all the time in fiction, going back thousands of years, and I hate it every single time. I detest this idea that you can't have power if you want it. I think that is such crap. True can't have power because she wants it. Yeah, it is so...
It's passive. It's like a very passive type view.
In supporting of the status quo and supporting the people in power who want to keep that power is this idea that heroes don't take power. It's foisted upon them, by those who would give it to them. This is such a regressive, passive, in favor of the status quo, as bad as it might be, idea. All this thing, I know most politicians are terrible, and I know that there's a lot of terrible, ambitious sociopaths seeking power and stuff, but the idea that if you're seeking power, that doesn't mean you should have it. It's just such crap. It's just such, you can't change anything, which is what this show was, the finale was about in the end. It was not letting things change. And Alan Moore, the anarchist writer of the comic, obviously he doesn't approve of what Ozymandias did. Well, I say obviously, the comic actually gives it a pretty fair scope of how you want your reaction to be. But in terms of his personality, obviously he doesn't approve of that. But he wrote something that changed in the comic. So this is tying in together, I think, the whole discussion. This idea that you can't change things, or just this fundamental idea you shouldn't change things, or changing things is bad. Ugh, I hate it.
I guess John Osterman wasn't seeking the power either, and I guess they're trying to make the point that he's sort of maintaining the status quo.
That's true.
A slight note of before I know you're about to say something, but just slight note on the whole seeking power thing. To be fair, Angela totally ate that egg voluntarily. She could have just not done it. She was a bit interested. And also the whole those who seek power shouldn't get it thing, that does come from the mouth of Adrian, and he's the malignant narcissist as well. I think Lindelof had a slight cope about this in one of the interviews he did, where he says well, I'm sure Veidt killing her was more of his own ego because he didn't think of stealing Manhattan's power first. And that's funny, but I think that could have had more critique in the episode itself, in my opinion.
Yeah, I was just going to say that this whole effusive love of Harry Potter is how we get the villain of fucking Grindelwald trying to stop the Holocaust, mirrored here by Lady True trying to clean the air, get rid of the world's missiles, all that malarkey.
I thought Laurie got the shaft. I would have liked to see more about her and Dr. Manhattan, considering they were together. And I don't think she was aware that Angela was married to him. Yeah,
well, she thought Cal was hot. She said that a few times. And at the funeral in episode 3, was it Cal that felt like he recognized her, or her that felt like she recognized him?
I think she just greeted him. He was like, "Do I know you?" And she was like, "No."
That's right.
I think that's all it was.
I think they have an off-screen conversation at one point.
Oh yeah, that's true. Yeah.
I think Jean Smart as Laurie Blake is the best casting of the show, and I think it was one part of the show that worked so well. Even when she was getting underserved in the finale, she still just worked like gangbusters for me. That was incredible casting. Fantastic.
Practically every line Laurie has in the finale is basically fan service of some kind, which is ironic considering, Dill, you say it would have been fan servicey to have more John-Laurie interaction, but John's the only reason Laurie is even in that room. That's why she was brought down by Senator Keene. It would have been eminently, interesting and good writing to actually play that relationship to some extent, at least to show how it matters a little bit. But, Manhattan just gets, plonked out of existence in a fairly muted and forgettable scene, and that's your lot, basically.
Did you guys get that if you click the passage about Dale Petey having canola oil in the last Peteypedia, it takes you to a picture that is a wanted page for Lube Man.
Oh, really?
Yeah, and isn't it a Gibbons drawing? I think I saw it on
Yeah,
Reddit.
yeah. It's by Dave
Yeah.
Gibbons. That's fantastic.
I'm surprised we didn't get Petey, like, even out of the Lube Man costume. Like, I mean, they spent all the money on that one Lube Man scene. And
I mean, in episode 3, he was well out of costume at the end.
oh, right.
Very funny.
Yeah, but just the actor, like, completely dropped out of the world. But, yeah, you know, I'm fine with no epic Lube Man saving the day. You know, the one scene was a good innings for him.
In short, would you guys want a second season of the show?
Yes, but by someone else, I think. If this was all he had to say, then I'm fine leaving it at that. But if someone else has something, sure.
I hear people suggest that, like, in 35 years, like, the next generation of authors could pick this up and build on, like, this show. But I feel like the material in this show is not like, what's the word?
Long-lasting.
Not long-lasting, not provoking enough for, like, future
Significant.
authors. Right, yeah. So I don't think that'll happen, and I don't think it should happen. Just leave well enough alone. Otherwise, you end up with a glib facsimile.
Yeah, I did love most of this show, but I definitely don't think it's going to inspire any new minds the way that the original comic inspired Lindelof in the first place.
Also, I don't want Watchmen to be a franchise that keeps coming back over and over for people to keep giving their take on. Like, it's a book, it happened, it was great, let it be finished. Okay, I appreciate some parts of the show, but, like, I don't want it to become an ongoing thing. Like, I'm totally public domain supporting. I think it's fine for people to respond to classic works, but that should be its own thing. Like, I just don't want it to be. I don't want it to be some franchise. You know, no matter as much as DC is trying to do that increasingly with the comics, I think that's very bad. So no more, please.
And Lindelof has talked very openly about how he wants Watchmen to be a franchise. Like, and he says things like, when he's talking about Joe Keen's monologue, he's defending it, and he says how Veidt explains his plan in the original book, and then he calls that a trope of genre, but it's also a trope of Watchmen. And, like, I don't know if I think that happens one time in a book is not a trope, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
For this non-existent franchise. So that's worrying.
The reception to Lost has scarred Lindelof off not dotting every I and crossing every T.
To be fair, they didn't cross every T. How the fuck was Will so sprightly at 105 years old? They just, they set that up and didn't answer it at all.
How did you drink that coffee?
Like, it's so ostentatiously set up as a mystery, and they just don't do anything with it at all. Like, no, he's just completely fine.
It's like, people online are saying, like, Dr. Manhattan just fucking died, and all people can talk about is Lube Man.
To be fair, I think that last PTpedia document sort of being the final word on Lube Man is almost a more satisfying final word on the show than the final shot of the show.
I love it, yeah.